When she could humiliate those who broke her, she chose forgiveness, and the Mafia boss changed. This is the story of Elena Vasquez, a woman who carried the scars of betrayal like stones in her pockets, and the moment she stood at the edge of revenge, looked it straight in the eye and walked away. When she could humiliate those who broke her, she chose forgiveness, and that single act of mercy did what no weapon, no threat, no amount of power ever could. It broke through the walls of a man the entire city feared. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened that night in the back room of a restaurant on Arthur Avenue in the Bronx, you need to know where Elena came from. You need to understand what was taken from her. And you need to see with your own eyes how a woman who had every reason to destroy the people who ruined her life made a choice that no one, not even she, expected. Elena Vasquez was born in a small apartment on the third floor of a crumbling building in East Harlem, New York City. Her mother, Rosa, had come from the Dominican Republic with nothing but a suitcase and a dream that her daughter would never have to scrub floors the way she did. Rosa worked 3 jobs. She cleaned offices in Midtown before dawn, she cooked lunches at a school cafeteria until 2 in the afternoon, and from 4 until 10 at night, she stood behind the counter of a laundromat on 116th Street, folding other people's clothes while her own daughter sat in the back doing homework under a flickering fluorescent light. Elena never complained. She understood, even as a child, that her mother's exhaustion was a form of love. Every crease under Rosa's eyes, every crack in her hands, every night she fell asleep, still wearing her work shoes, it was all for Elena. And Elena honored that sacrifice the only way she knew how. She studied. She studied like her life depended on it, because in many ways it did. By the time Elena was 16, she was the top student at her public high school. Her teachers said she had a gift, not just intelligence, but a way of seeing the world that was sharper than most adults. She could read a room the way a chess player reads a board, always 3 moves ahead, always aware of what people were not saying. It was a skill she had learned from growing up in a neighborhood where silence often carried more weight than words. Her dream was to become a lawyer, not a corporate lawyer sitting in a glass tower, but a public defender, someone who would stand in courtrooms and fight for people like her mother, people who worked themselves to the bone and still got pushed around by a system that did not care about them. Elena had seen it too many times. She had watched her mother get cheated out of wages. She had seen neighbors evicted with nowhere to go. She had witnessed the quiet, grinding injustice of poverty, and she wanted to change it. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It started with a man named Marco De Luca. Marco was 24 years old, charming in the way that dangerous people often are, with a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room and eyes that never quite told the truth. He drove a black car with tinted windows and always seemed to have cash. He showed up in Elena's neighborhood like a season changing, gradually at first, and then all at once. Elena met him at a bodega on a Tuesday afternoon. She was buying rice and beans for dinner, counting quarters in her palm, when Marco walked in and paid for her groceries without a word. She tried to refuse. He insisted. He said it was nothing, just a small thing, and the way he said it, casually, like generosity was as natural to him as breathing, made her feel something she had not felt in a long time. She felt seen. They started talking. Then they started meeting. He would pick her up after school, take her to diners she had never been to, places with real tablecloths and menus without prices. He asked about her dreams, and he listened, really listened, in a way that made Elena believe he cared. He told her she was brilliant. He told her she was going to change the world. And she believed him, because when you have spent your whole life being invisible, the first person who truly sees you becomes your entire universe. What Elena did not know, what she could not have known, was that Marco De Luca was not just some neighborhood guy with a good heart and deep pockets. Marco worked for Vincent Moretti, one of the most powerful organized crime figures in New York City. Vincent ran his operation out of the Bronx with tendrils that stretched into Brooklyn, Queens, and parts of New Jersey. His businesses looked legitimate on the surface: restaurants, construction companies, a chain of dry cleaners. But underneath, they were channels for money that came from places no one talked about in daylight. Marco was not a boss. He was not even close. He was what they called a runner, someone who handled small tasks, delivered messages, collected payments. But he had ambitions. He wanted to climb, and he believed that having someone like Elena by his side, smart, beautiful, respectable, would help him do exactly that. For 6 months, Elena lived in a kind of dream. Marco showered her with gifts. He bought her a laptop for school. He paid for a tutor to help her prepare for college entrance exams. He even gave her mother money to cover rent, which Rosa accepted, reluctantly, because even she could see how happy her daughter was, and happiness was something Rosa had never been able to afford to give. But dreams, especially the ones built on lies, have a way of ending. It happened on a Friday night in March. Elena had gone to Marco's apartment to surprise him for his birthday. She had saved up money from a part-time job at a bookstore to buy him a watch. Nothing expensive, just a simple silver watch with his initials engraved on the back. She let herself in with the key he had given her, expecting to find an empty apartment she could decorate with balloons. Instead, she found Marco sitting at the kitchen table with 2 men she had never seen before. There were stacks of cash on the table, rubber-banded and organized in rows. There were documents she did not understand, shipping manifests, account numbers, names of businesses. And there was a gun, sitting on the edge of the table like it was as ordinary as a salt shaker. Marco's face changed the moment he saw her. The warmth vanished, the charm evaporated. What replaced it was something cold and mechanical, like a mask being pulled away to reveal the gears beneath. "You should not be here," he said. Not with anger, with something worse, with calculation. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, the watch in her hand, the balloons deflating in her chest. "Marco, what is this?" she whispered. He stood up and walked toward her, and for the first time she noticed the way the 2 men at the table looked at her, not with curiosity, but with the kind of appraisal that made her skin crawl, like they were measuring her and deciding what she was worth. "Elena, listen to me carefully," Marco said, his voice low. "You did not see this. You were never here. Do you understand?" She nodded. "Because fear has a way of making your body agree to things your mind has not processed yet." He walked her to the door and closed it behind her. She stood in the hallway for a long time, hearing muffled voices. On the other side, her heart hammering so loud she was certain the neighbors could hear it. She went home. She did not sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment she had spent with Marco, re-examining every gift, every compliment, every seemingly casual question he had asked about her neighborhood, her mother's schedule, the layout of the buildings around them. And slowly, like a photograph developing in dark water, the truth began to emerge. She had been used, not as a girlfriend, not as a partner, as a prop. Marco had kept her close because she was his cover, a hard-working, respectable girl from East Harlem who made him look like something he was not. And every kindness he had shown her, every dollar he had spent, had been an investment in his own image, paid for with money that came from pain she could not even imagine. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She curled into herself on her narrow bed and cried without making a sound, because Rosa was sleeping in the next room, and Elena had learned long ago that some kinds of pain are too heavy to share. The next morning, she made a decision. She would leave Marco. She would cut him off completely, return every gift, and walk away before whatever world he was part of swallowed her whole. But Marco did not make it easy. When she told him it was over, his reaction was not what she expected. He did not yell, he did not threaten, he did something far worse. He laughed. It was a short, dismissive laugh, the kind you give a child who says something naive. "You think you can just walk away," he said. "Elena, sweetheart, you have been in my apartment. You have seen things. The people I work with, they do not like loose ends." "Are you threatening me?" she asked, and she was proud that her voice did not shake even though her hands were trembling behind her back. "I am protecting you," he said. "Stay with me and you are safe. Leave, and I cannot guarantee anything." Elena looked At him, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw him clearly. Not the charming man who bought her groceries, not the attentive boyfriend who listened to her dreams. She saw a small, frightened person hiding behind a costume of confidence, someone who mistook control for love and fear for loyalty. "I would rather be unsafe and free," she said, "than safe and trapped." She turned and walked out, and she did not look back. But Marco's warning was not empty. Within a week, strange things started happening. A car she did not recognize parked outside her building for hours at a time. Her mother received a phone call from an unknown number, just silence on the other end, then a click. A note appeared under their apartment door with no words, just a photograph of Elena walking to school, taken from across the street. Rosa was terrified. She wanted to go to the authorities, but Elena knew that in their neighborhood that could make things worse. The people Marco worked for had connections everywhere, in City Hall, in courthouses, in precinct offices. Going to the law was like walking into a maze with no exit. So Elena did something that broke her heart. She dropped out of school. She packed a single bag, told her mother she had gotten a scholarship to a program upstate, and left East Harlem in the middle of the night on a Greyhound bus, headed for a city she had never been to. She was 17 years old. She had $43 in her pocket, a fake ID she had gotten from a girl in her building, and a fear so deep it felt like it had replaced her bones. She ended up in Chicago. She chose it because it was far enough from New York to feel like another country, and because a girl she had once met at a summer program had mentioned a shelter on the South Side that helped young women in crisis. The shelter was called Haven House. It was a converted church basement on a street lined with vacant lots and chain-link fences. The walls were painted a pale yellow that was meant to feel warm, but instead felt like an apology. There were 12 beds, each separated by a thin curtain, and a communal kitchen where the refrigerator hummed so loudly it sounded like it was trying to tell you something. Elena stayed at Haven House for 4 months. She worked in the kitchen, mopping floors and washing dishes that never seemed to end. She kept to herself, spoke little, and spent her free time reading books from a donation box in the corner. Old paperbacks, with broken spines and missing pages, stories about people whose lives were harder than hers, which somehow made her feel less alone. During those months, she thought about Marco constantly, not with longing, that had burned away quickly, but with a kind of clinical curiosity. How had she not seen it? How had she let someone so hollow get so close to the center of her life? She turned the question over and over like a stone in her hand, and slowly, she began to understand something important. She had not been weak. She had been hungry. Hungry for attention, for validation, for someone to tell her she mattered. And Marco had known exactly how to feed that hunger while keeping her starving for more. That understanding changed her. It hardened something inside her that had been soft, but it also clarified something that had been blurry. She knew now what she wanted, not just to survive, but to build a life so solid, so grounded in her own strength, that no one could ever use her again. She got a job at a restaurant. It was a small Italian place called Fontana's, owned by a retired teacher named Diane, who had inherited it from her father. Diane was a tall woman with silver hair and a voice that could quiet a room without raising itself above a whisper. She saw something in Elena, the same thing Elena's teachers had seen years ago, and she gave her a chance. Elena started as a dishwasher, and within 3 months was waiting tables. Within 6 months, she was helping Diane manage the books. Within a year, Diane trusted her enough to leave her in charge when she went on vacation, something Diane had never done with anyone. Elena saved every dollar she could. She moved out of Haven House and into a tiny studio apartment above a hardware store. It had one window that faced a brick wall, a radiator that clanged at night like someone knocking to get in, and a kitchen so small you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms. But it was hers, and that made it beautiful. She also started studying again. She enrolled in night classes at a community college, picking up where she had left off. It was harder now. She was older, more tired, and the coursework felt like it belonged to a different life. But she pushed through with the same quiet determination that had carried her this far. 2 years passed. Elena was 19, working full-time at Fontana's and carrying a full course load at night. She had not spoken to her mother in all that time, and the guilt of it was a constant ache, like a bruise that never healed. She wanted to call. She wanted to hear Rosa's voice, to tell her she was alive and safe and working towards something. But she was afraid. Afraid that calling would somehow lead Marco or his people back to her. Afraid that the fragile new life she had built would shatter like glass at the sound of her mother's voice. And then, on a cold Tuesday evening in November, everything changed again. Elena was closing up the restaurant, wiping down tables and stacking chairs, when the front door opened. She looked up, ready to tell whoever it was that they were closed, and the words died in her throat. Standing in the doorway was a man she had never seen before, but whose presence filled the room like a change in pressure before a storm. He was in his mid-50s, with silver hair combed back from a broad forehead, a dark overcoat that looked like it cost more than her apartment, and eyes that were simultaneously warm and terrifying. The eyes of someone who had seen everything the world could offer, both the beauty and the brutality, and had made peace with all of it. Behind him stood 2 younger men, large and silent, positioned with the practiced ease of people who were used to being in the background but ready to step forward at any moment. "We are closed," Elena said. Her voice was steady, but her hand tightened around the rag she was holding. The man smiled. It was a real smile, not the performative kind Marco used to wear, but the kind that comes from genuine amusement. "I know," he said. "I did not come to eat. I came to talk to you, Elena." The sound of her name in his mouth was like a splash of cold water. She had not told anyone in Chicago her real name. At Fontana's she went by Elisa, a small change but one that had felt necessary, a thin wall between who she was and who she was becoming. "Who are you?" she asked. "My name is Vincent Moretti," the man said, and the room seemed to get smaller. "Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one, stories that will grip your heart and refuse to let go, are shared here every week. If you do not want to miss what happens next, hit that subscribe button right now, because Elena's journey is about to take a turn that will leave you speechless. Vincent Moretti. The name landed in the room like a dropped anchor, and Elena felt the floor shift beneath her feet. She knew that name. She had heard Marco say it in hushed tones, the way people in church say the name of a saint, with reverence, with fear, and with the understanding that this was a figure whose reach extended far beyond what the eye could see. Vincent stood there in the doorway of Fontana's, perfectly still, as if time arranged itself around him rather than the other way around. The 2 men behind him did not move, did not speak. They were extensions of him, as natural and as unquestioned as his shadow. Elena's mind raced. She thought about the back door, the one that led through the kitchen and into the alley behind the restaurant. She calculated how many steps it would take, how many seconds, whether she could grab her jacket from the hook by the walk-in cooler before. "Please," Vincent said, as if reading her thoughts, "sit down. I promise you I am not here to hurt you." "People who have to promise they will not hurt you are usually the ones who do," Eleanor replied. Vincent's eyebrows rose slightly, and for a moment, something that looked almost like respect flickered across his face. "That is a fair point," he said, "but I am an old man with bad knees, and I have come a long way. Allow me 5 minutes." He pulled out a chair and sat down at the nearest table, unbuttoning his overcoat with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who was accustomed to being waited for. One of the men behind him stepped forward and pulled out the chair across from Vincent, gesturing for Elena to sit. She did not sit. She stood behind the counter, the rag still in her hand, her back to the kitchen door, maintaining the maximum distance the small dining room allowed. 5 minutes, she said. Vincent nodded. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her the way a painter looks at a canvas, not with hunger but with appreciation. "You are a remarkable young woman, Elena," he began. "I have been watching you for some time now." "That is not the comforting sentence you think it is," she said. He chuckled, softly. "No, I suppose it is not. Let me rephrase. I have been aware of you since your involvement with Marco De Luca. Marco works for me, as I am sure you have gathered. When you left New York, Marco reported that you had disappeared, and he was concerned about what you might have seen or heard. Eleanor's stomach tightened, but she kept her face neutral. I did not see anything. I do not know anything about your business. I believe you, Vincent said. That is actually why I am here. You see, Marco wanted me to send people after you, to make sure you would not talk, to tie up, as he put it, a loose end. The words hung in the air. Elena felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise, but she did not blink, did not flinch. She had spent 2 years learning how to swallow fear and keep moving. But I did not send anyone after you, Vincent continued. Do you know why? Because you are a generous and compassionate man, Elena said, and the sarcasm in her voice was sharp enough to cut. Vincent smiled again. Because I looked into you, not a casual glance, a thorough investigation, and what I found was interesting. Top of your class before you dropped out, reading law textbooks at 14, a mother who works 3 jobs and has never once asked for anything she did not earn. And you, 17 years old, alone in a city you have never been to, and within 2 years you have a job, an apartment, and you are back in school. He paused, letting the silence settle. Most people who run from my world do not build new lives, Elena. They hide, they crumble, they self-destruct. But you built something, and I respect that. Elena did not know what to do with his respect. It felt like being handed a gift wrapped in barbed wire. You could see the intention, but you knew it would cut you if you held it too close. What do you want? She asked. Vincent leaned back in his chair. I have a problem, a significant one. My organization is going through a transition. The old ways of operating are no longer sustainable. Law enforcement is more sophisticated, the federal government is more aggressive, and the younger generation in my world is impatient and reckless. I need someone who can help me restructure the legitimate side of my business, the restaurants, the construction companies, the real estate holdings. Someone with intelligence, discretion, and no existing ties to anyone in my world. You want me to work for you, Elena said flatly. I want to offer you an opportunity, Vincent corrected. I will pay for the rest of your education, a full ride, any university you want, law school included. In return, when you graduate, you come work for my companies, the legal ones. You help me separate the wheat from the chaff, build something that can stand on its own without the shadows. Elena stared at him. The offer was so audacious, so perfectly calibrated to her deepest desires, that it felt like a trap. And perhaps it was. But it was also the first real chance anyone had given her since Diane handed her a dish rag and said, "Show me what you can do." "And if I say no?" she asked. Vincent spread his hands. "Then I finish my coffee, I walk out that door, and you never see me again. No consequences, no retaliation. I give you my word." "Your word," Elena repeated. "The word of a man who runs. The word of a man who has more to lose by breaking it than by keeping it." Vincent interrupted gently. "Reputation is everything in my world, Elena. And I'm telling you on my reputation that this is a genuine offer with no strings attached beyond what I have described." Elena stood behind the counter for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. The fluorescent light above the kitchen door buzzed. Outside, a car passed, its headlights sweeping across the window and then vanishing. She thought about her mother, alone in East Harlem, still scrubbing floors and folding other people's clothes. She thought about the law textbooks she studied, at night, the dream of standing in a courtroom and speaking for people who had no voice. She thought about Marco and the way his charm had hidden something rotten, and how she had promised herself never to be deceived again. And she thought about what it meant to sit across the table from a man like Vincent Moretti and say yes. "I need to think about it," she said. Vincent nodded. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a business card on the table. It was plain white with a phone number, printed in simple black type. No name, no address, no logo. "Take all the time you need," he said. He stood, buttoned his coat, and walked toward the door. At the threshold he paused and turned back. "One more thing," he said. I told Marco to leave you alone, permanently. Whatever he did to you, whatever fear he planted, it is over. You have my guarantee." He left. The two men followed. The door closed, and Elena stood alone in the empty restaurant, holding a business card that weighed more than anything she had ever carried. She did not sleep that night. She sat on her bed in her tiny apartment, the card propped up against the lamp on her nightstand, and she argued with herself until dawn. The rational part of her brain said no, said it loudly, emphatically, with footnotes and citations. Working for Vincent Moretti, even on the legal side, meant proximity to a world she had already been burned by. It meant compromising the moral clarity she had fought so hard to maintain. It meant becoming in some small way complicit. But there was another voice, quieter and more persistent, that said something else entirely. It said, "This is how you change things. Not by staying small and safe and invisible, but by stepping into the rooms where power lives and reshaping them from the inside." It said, "Your mother did not work 3 jobs so you could wash dishes for the rest of your life." It said, "Sometimes the only way out is through." 3 days later, she called the number on the card. The voice that answered was not Vincent's. It was a woman's voice, crisp and professional, who said simply, "Yes?" "Tell Mr. Moretti that Elena accepts his offer," she said, "but I have conditions." There was a pause. "Go ahead." "First, I choose the university. He does not get a say in where I go or what I study. Second, while I am in school, I have no contact with anyone in his organization. No check-ins, no reports, no favors. Third, when I graduate and begin working for his companies, I answer only to him, not to Marco, not to anyone else. And fourth," she took a breath, "he helps me bring my mother to Chicago." The line was silent for a moment. Then the woman said, "Hold, please." 2 minutes later, she came back. "Mr. Moretti agrees to all 4 conditions. He says, and I quote, 'I knew she would have conditions. That is why I chose her.'" Eleanor hung up the phone and sat on the edge of her bed. Her hands were shaking, but this time it was not from fear. It was from something she had not felt in a very long time, the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump. Within a month, Rosa Vasquez was living in a small but comfortable apartment in the Logan Square neighborhood of Chicago. Elena had told her a version of the truth, that a benefactor had offered to fund her education, that it was legitimate, that she could not say more than that. Rosa had questions, many questions, but she was also a woman who had learned to accept blessings without examining them too closely, because in her experience, looking too hard at a good thing was a sure way to make it disappear. Their reunion was quiet and devastating. Elena had expected tears, shouting, accusations. Instead, Rosa opened the door of her new apartment, saw her daughter standing there, and simply pulled her into an embrace so tight it seemed designed to squeeze out all the distance and silence of the past 2 years. They stood like that for a long time, neither of them speaking, because some reunions happen in a language older than words. Eleanor enrolled at the University of Chicago. She chose it deliberately, a world-class institution far enough from New York to maintain her distance from Marco's world, but prestigious enough to open any door she might need opened later. She majored in political science with a minor in economics, and she attacked her studies with a ferocity that startled her professors. She was not just smart, she was driven, in a way that went beyond ambition. Every assignment she completed, every exam she aced, every paper she wrote was a brick in the wall she was building between herself and the girl she had been, the girl who had been fooled by a charming man with a dark car and a darker purpose. During her time at the university, she kept her promise to Vincent. She had no contact with his organization. No one came to check on her. No one called. The tuition was paid by a trust fund set up in her name, managed by a law firm she had never heard of, and the money appeared in her account at the beginning of each semester with the reliability of sunrise. She told no one about the arrangement, not her classmates, not her professors, not even the few friends she made during those years, a tight circle of women who studied together, argued about politics over cheap coffee, and dreamed out loud about the kind of world they wanted to build. One of those friends was a woman named Keisha Morgan. Keisha was from the South Side, a neighborhood called Englewood, which was known for two things: its resilience and its violence. She was studying criminal justice, and she had a way of cutting through complexity with a single sentence that made Elena think of a surgeon, precise, efficient, and unafraid of what she might find. They became close, not in the loud, performative way that some friendships operate, but in the quieter way, the way of two people who recognized in each other a shared understanding of what it means to come from a place that the world has written off, and to refuse to accept that verdict. It was Keisha who, during a late-night study session in their junior year, asked the question Elena had been avoiding. "Elisa, or Elena, or whatever your real name is, where does the money come from?" Elena looked up from her textbook. "What money?" Keisha gave her a look that said, "Do not play with me. The tuition, the apartment, the way your mom suddenly moved to Chicago with no job, and no connections. I am not judging. I am asking because I care about you and because you are the smartest person I know, which means that whatever you are mixed up in, you walked into it with your eyes open. I just want to know what I am looking at." Elena was quiet for a long time. The library around them was nearly empty. The heating vents whispered. Outside, snow was falling, softening the edges of the campus like a scene in a snow globe. "If I told you," Elena said carefully, "it would put you in a position where you would have to make a choice, and I do not want to do that to you." Keisha studied her face. "That bad?" "Not bad exactly. Just complicated. In a way that does not have clean lines." Keisha nodded slowly. "Okay, I trust you. But if you ever need help, the kind of help that does not care about clean lines, you know where I am." Elena felt something crack inside her chest, in the good way, the way ice cracks in spring when the river underneath starts moving. Again. She had spent so long being alone with her secrets that the simple act of someone saying, "I trust you," without demanding proof, felt like the most generous thing anyone had ever done. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it with every cell in her body. She graduated summa cum laude. She was accepted to law school at Northwestern, and she completed her degree in 2.5 years instead of 3, because by that point, waiting felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. She passed the bar on her first attempt, with a score that put her in the top 3% of test takers that year. And then, true to her word, she called the number on the card. This time, Vincent Moretti answered himself. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice carried the warmth of someone greeting a long-expected guest. "I have been waiting for this call." "I am ready," she said. "I know you are," he replied. "Come to New York. There is someone I want you to meet." She did not ask who. She booked a flight, packed a bag and told her mother she had a job interview, which was not entirely a lie. It was just a version of the truth that had been edited for content. She arrived in New York on a Tuesday, a detail she would remember later, because Tuesdays had a way of being significant in her life. The city was different from how she remembered it, or maybe she was different. The buildings seemed shorter, the streets narrower, the noise less overwhelming. She had left as a frightened teenager. She was returning as something else entirely, a woman with a law degree, a strategic mind, and a debt she intended to repay on her own terms. A car picked her up at the airport. It was black, like Marco's had been, but cleaner, newer, and driven by a woman with short grey hair and the focused expression of someone who took her work seriously. She did not speak during the drive, and Elena did not try to make conversation. She watched the city pass through the tinted windows and thought about the last time she had been here, fleeing in the middle of the night with $43 and a heart full of fear. They drove to a building in Midtown, a glass tower that looked like every other glass tower in Manhattan, anonymous and expensive. The driver let her out at a side entrance, and a man in a suit escorted her to an elevator that required a key card. They went up. The numbers on the panel climbed past 20, past 30, Past 40, they stopped at 46. The doors opened onto a floor. That was nothing like what Elena had expected. She had anticipated something dark and dramatic. Leather chairs, cigar smoke, the cliched aesthetic of organized power. Instead, she found a modern office space bathed in natural light, with clean lines, glass walls, and the quiet hum of a legitimate business operation. People sat at desks, typed on computers, made phone calls. It looked like any corporate office in America, and sitting at the far end of the room behind a desk that was notable, only for its simplicity, was Vincent Moretti. He stood when he saw her. He looked older than she remembered, the silver hair thinner, the lines on his face deeper, but his eyes were the same, alert, assessing, and, unless she was mistaken, genuinely pleased. "Elena," he said. "Welcome back." She shook his hand. It was firm and dry. "Mr. Moretti." "Vincent," he corrected. "If we are going to work together, we should be on a first-name basis." He gestured for her to sit and offered her coffee, which she accepted more out of habit than desire. As they settled into their chairs, Vincent studied her the way he had that first night at Fontana's, with that painter's gaze, as if he were trying to capture something essential about her that could not be reduced to words. "You look different," he said. "I am different," she replied. He nodded. "Good, because what I am about to ask of you will require everything you have, and possibly more." He explained the situation. Over the past 5 years while Elena was in school, the landscape had shifted dramatically. Federal investigations had intensified. Several of Vincent's associates had been indicted or had turned informant. The old structures were crumbling, and the younger generation, impatient, violent, and careless, was making things worse. Vincent had made a decision. He wanted to go legitimate, not the half-measure kind of legitimate that most people in his position attempted, keeping one foot in the shadows while pretending to stand in the light, but genuinely, completely, irreversibly legitimate. He wanted to dismantle the illegal operations, restructure the legal businesses, and build something that could survive without the architecture of fear that had supported it for decades. "Why?" Elena asked. It was the obvious question, and she had learned that obvious questions often had the most revealing answers. Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a photograph. It showed a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark curly hair and Vincent's eyes. She was laughing at something off camera, her face lit up with the kind of joy that only children can produce. Total, unself-conscious, and heartbreakingly temporary. "My granddaughter," Vincent said. "Sophia. She is the daughter of my son, Anthony, who wants nothing to do with me or my business. He moved to California 10 years ago and has not spoken to me since. Sophia does not know who I am." He placed the photograph on the desk between them. "I am 63 years old, Elena. I have spent my entire life building something that the world sees as a disease, and perhaps they are right. But I do not want that to be my legacy. I do not want to be a cautionary tale. I want to be someone my granddaughter can look up one day and say, 'That was my grandfather and he was a good man.' Is that naive? Probably. Is it too late? Maybe. But I would rather die trying than die knowing I did. Not try at all." Elena looked at the photograph. She looked at Vincent, and she saw something she had not expected to see in the eyes of a man who had spent his life in the underworld. Vulnerability, genuine, unguarded, aching vulnerability. It was the look of a man who had finally realized that power without purpose is just a cage with a better view. "I will help you," she said, "but I need you to understand something. I am not doing this for you. I am doing this because I believe that every person, no matter what they have done, deserves the chance to become something better. And if I am going to stake my career, my reputation, and possibly my safety on that belief, then I need you to be completely honest with me. No half-truths, no secrets, no shadow operations running in the background while I am trying to build something clean. Can you do that?" Vincent held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "I can." "Then we have a deal, Elena said. They shook hands again. And in that moment, standing, in a glass office 46 floors above a city that had both broken and rebuilt her, Elena Vasquez stepped into the most dangerous chapter of her life. Not because she was naive, but because she believed, with every fiber of her being, that the most radical act a person can commit in a broken world is to choose hope. But hope, as Elena was about to discover, is not the same thing as safety, and the people who had the most to lose from Vincent's transformation were already watching. Elena's first 3 months at Moretti Holdings were a masterclass in controlled chaos. The legitimate side of Vincent's empire was vast: 14 restaurants across the 5 boroughs, a construction company with contracts in 3 states, a chain of dry cleaning facilities, 2 parking garages in Manhattan, and a real estate portfolio that included apartment buildings in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. On paper, it was a mid-sized business conglomerate with healthy revenues and a diversified asset base. In reality, it was a tangled web of phantom invoices, overstated payrolls, and accounting practices that would make a forensic auditor weep. Elena's job was to untangle it, to separate the clean money from the dirty, restructure the management of each business, install transparent financial systems, and prepare the entire operation for the day when Vincent would walk away from the shadows permanently. It was, by any measure, an impossible task, but Elena had built her entire life on doing things that others considered impossible, and she was not about to stop now. She worked 16-hour days. She reviewed contracts, interviewed managers, visited every restaurant and job site personally, and compiled a database of every financial transaction the company had made in the past 10 years. She fired people who could not be trusted, hired people who could, and established protocols so rigorous that even Vincent raised an eyebrow. "You run this office like a general," he said to her one afternoon, watching her reorganize the filing system in the main conference room. "I run it like someone who knows what is at stake," she replied without looking up. But restructuring the finances was the easy part. The hard part was the people. Vincent's organization was not a corporation in the traditional sense. It was a family, not by blood, but by loyalty, obligation, and mutual dependence. People had worked for Vincent for decades. They had built their lives around his operation, raised their children on its payroll, and measured their self-worth by their proximity to his power. Telling them that the rules were changing was like telling someone that the ground they were standing on was no longer solid. Some of them adapted. The restaurant managers, for example, were mostly hard-working people who had always wanted to run legitimate businesses but had been forced to play along with the accounting tricks because that was how things were done. When Elena told them they could stop inflating their receipts and start running their kitchens the way they actually wanted to, many of them reacted with visible relief. But others were not so accommodating, and the most dangerous of them all was a man named Dominic Ferraro. Dominic was Vincent's underboss, his second in command, the man who handled the parts of the operation that Vincent preferred not to discuss in polite company. He was in his late 40s, built like a refrigerator, with a shaved head and the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from control. He had been with Vincent for over 20 years, and he had earned his position not through intelligence or charisma, but through an unflinching willingness to do whatever was necessary, whenever it was necessary, without hesitation or remorse. Dominic did not like Elena. He did not hide it. From the first day she walked into the office, he treated her with the kind of icy contempt that certain men reserve for women they perceive as threats, not to their safety, but to their status. He addressed her as the girl in meetings. He forgot to include her in emails about important decisions. He contradicted her recommendations in front of Vincent, not with better ideas, but with dismissive shrugs and the implication that she was too young, too female, and too outside to understand how things really worked. Eleanor handled it the way she handled most obstacles, by being better than him at everything he cared about. She produced reports that were more thorough than his. She identified financial vulnerabilities he had missed. She earned the trust of people who had known Dominic for years, and she did it all without raising her voice, without losing her temper, and without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. But Dominic was not just petty, he was strategic, and he was terrified. Because Dominic understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, what Elena's presence meant. If Vincent went legitimate, truly legitimate, then Dominic's entire reason for existing would evaporate. He was a man whose skills were suited for a specific kind of world, and that world was disappearing. Without the shadows, without the fear, without the unspoken threat of consequences, Dominic was just a middle-aged man with no marketable skills and a resume he could never show anyone. So he began to undermine her, quietly, carefully, with the patience of someone who had spent decades operating in an environment where the wrong move at the wrong time could end your life. It started with whispers, small comments made to the right people at the right time, suggestions that Elena could not be trusted, that she was a plant from law enforcement, that she was using Vincent's affection to position herself for some hidden agenda. Dominic did not make accusations, he planted seeds and let other people's imaginations do the watering. Then the whispers escalated. Documents disappeared from Elena's desk. A meeting she had scheduled with a key construction contractor was cancelled without her knowledge. A shipment of supplies for one of the restaurants arrived at the wrong address, an address, she later discovered, that had been changed in the system by someone with access to the company's logistics software. Elena knew it was Dominic. She could not prove it. The man was too experienced for that. But she knew. And she knew that confronting him directly would only give him what he wanted. Evidence that she was emotional, reactive, and therefore unreliable. So she played the long game. She documented everything, every missing file, every sabotaged meeting, every mistake that could be traced back to his sphere of influence. She built a case, not a legal one, not yet, but an informational one. A comprehensive picture of Dominic's pattern of interference that she could present to Vincent when the time was right. The time came sooner than she expected. It was a Thursday evening, about 4 months into her tenure, when Vincent called her into his office. He looked tired, not the ordinary tiredness of a long day, but the deep, bone-level exhaustion of a man carrying a weight that had been accumulating for decades. "Sit down, Elena," he said. His voice was different, softer, more careful, like someone handling something fragile. She sat. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to listen before you respond." She nodded. "Dominic came to me this morning. He told me that you have been meeting privately with federal investigators. He says you are cooperating with a grand jury investigation into my organization. He says he has evidence, recordings, emails, something, that proves you are working against me from the inside." Elena felt the blood drain from her face, not from guilt, she had never spoken to a single investigator, but from the sheer audacity of the accusation and the realization of how carefully Dominic had been preparing this moment. "That is a lie," she said. Her voice was calm, but her heart was a drum roll. "I know," Vincent said. She blinked. "You know?" "I have known Dominic for 23 years. I know how he operates. I know his patterns, his tells, his methods. He is afraid, Elena. He sees what is coming, and he is trying to stop it the only way he knows how, by destroying the person who represents the change he cannot accept." "Then why are you telling me this?" Elena asked. Vincent leaned forward. "Because I want you to understand what you are up against. This is not a corporate disagreement. This is not office politics. Dominic is a man who has spent his entire adult life in a world where problems are solved permanently, and he sees you as a problem." The words hung in the air between them. "Are you telling me I am in danger?" Elena asked. "I am telling you that I will protect you," Vincent said, "but I am also telling you the truth, because you asked me for the truth, and I intend to keep my word. Dominic is making moves. I am watching them, but I need you to be careful, more careful than you have ever been." Elena sat with this for a long time. The office was quiet. The city lights glittered outside the window like a field of earthbound stars. "What are you going to do about him?" she asked. What I should have done a long time ago, Vincent said. But not yet. The timing has to be right. If I move against Dominic too quickly, it will create a power vacuum that could be even more dangerous than Dominic himself. I need to put the right structures in place first, and that is what you are here for. Elena understood. She was not just restructuring a business, she was helping dismantle a machine while it was still running, and every bolt she removed had to be replaced with something stronger before the whole thing collapsed. I understand, she said, but I want something in return. Name it. Marco De Luca. I want to know where he is and what he is doing. Not because I want to see him. I never want to see him again. But because I need to know that he is not part of whatever Dominic is planning. Marco is not smart enough to be truly dangerous, but he is connected enough to be useful, and men like Dominic know how to use useful people. Vincent nodded slowly. I will find out. You have my word. She left his office that night feeling something she had not expected, not fear, not anger, but a strange, steely clarity. The kind that comes when the fog lifts and you can finally see the battlefield for what it is. If you feel something right now, if Elena's strength is stirring something inside you, leave a comment saying, "Stay strong, Elena." Let her story, and every story like it, know that someone out there is listening. Drop that comment right now. Over the next several weeks, Elena worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She knew she was running out of time, not in the dramatic ticking clock sense, but in the slower, more insidious way that a tide comes in. Dominic was consolidating his allies. People who had been friendly to Elena began to withdraw, their greetings cooler, their eyes evasive. Meetings that had been productive became tense. The air in the office changed, the way air changes before a storm. You cannot point to the exact moment it shifts, but you can feel it on your skin. She threw herself into the restructuring plan. She worked nights and weekends, poring over contracts, renegotiating deals, and building a framework that could sustain the legitimate businesses independently of any illegal support. She brought in outside consultants, carefully vetted professionals who knew nothing about the shadowy side of Moretti Holdings to help modernize the operations, and she began to see results. The restaurants were turning higher profits under transparent management. The construction company won a major contract with the city, a real contract, earned through competitive bidding, not backroom deals. One of the real estate holdings was refinanced at a better rate after Elena cleaned up the accounting and presented the actual numbers to the bank. Vincent watched all of this with a kind of quiet amazement. He had spent his life in a world where trust was a weakness and transparency was a death sentence, and here was this young woman proving that doing things the right way could actually work. It challenged everything he believed, and he was old enough and wise enough to let himself be challenged. "You remind me of my wife," he said to Elena one evening as they sat in his office reviewing the quarterly numbers. Elena looked up. Vincent had mentioned his wife only once before, a brief reference to Maria in a context that made it clear she was no longer alive. "Maria was like you," he continued. "She saw the world the way it could be, not the way it was. She believed that people were capable of change, even when all the evidence suggested otherwise. I used to think she was naive. Now I think she was the bravest person I have ever known." "What happened to her?" Elena asked softly. Vincent's face did something Elena had never seen before. It crumpled, not dramatically, not with tears or theatrics, but with a quiet implosion, like a building coming down in slow motion, the structure folding inward on itself. "She got sick," he said, 5 years ago. "It was cancer, the kind that moves fast and does not care how much money you have or how many favors you can call in. I brought in the best doctors, the best treatments, the best everything, and none of it mattered. She was gone in 4 months. He paused. His hands, resting on the desk, were very still. "The day she passed, she held my hand and she said, 'Vincent, promise me you will become the man I always knew you could be.' And I promised. But for 5 years I did nothing. I told myself I was waiting for the right time, the right opportunity, the right circumstances. But the truth is, I was afraid. afraid that becoming someone new meant admitting that the person I had been was not worth keeping. He looked at Elena. And then you walked into a restaurant in Chicago with a rag in your hand and told me that people who promise not to hurt you are usually the ones who do. And I thought, there is someone brave enough to help me keep my promise. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She had spent so long seeing Vincent through a lens of strategic calculation, analyzing his motives, assessing his reliability, measuring every word. He said, against the framework of what she knew about men in his position, that she had almost forgotten he was also a person who had lost someone he loved and was trying, in his imperfect, clumsy, morally complicated way, to honor her memory. Maria sounds like she was an extraordinary woman, Elena said. She was, Vincent agreed, and she would have liked you very much. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who had arrived at the same place from very different directions, united by a shared belief that the future did not have to be a copy of the past, but the future, as Elena was about to learn, has a way of arriving on its own schedule. The call came at 3 in the morning. Elena's phone buzzed on the nightstand of her apartment in the financial district, a small one-bedroom that Vincent's company had provided as part of her employment package. She had been asleep for maybe 2 hours, having worked until after midnight on a filing for the construction company's new city contract. She answered on the third ring. The voice on the other end was Sal Toretti, one of the few people in Vincent's inner circle who had genuinely embraced the restructuring. Sal was in his 60s, a quiet, bookish man who had managed Vincent's accounting for decades and who had been secretly relieved when Elena arrived to clean things up. "Elena, you need to come to the office right now," Sal said. His voice was shaking. Sal was not a man who shook easily. "What happened?" Eleanor asked, already reaching for her clothes. "It is Dominic. He has made his move." 40 minutes later, Eleanor stood in the main conference room of Moretti Holdings, looking at the aftermath of a coup. While she had been building, Dominic had been dismantling. Not the business, but the alliance that held it together. Over the past several weeks, moving with a patience and precision that Elena had to reluctantly admire, he had systematically turned a majority of Vincent's key lieutenants against the restructuring. He had done it not with threats, that would have been too crude, but with something far more effective: money. He had offered them a bigger piece of the old pie, promising that if Vincent's transformation was derailed, the profitable shadow operations would not only continue but expand. And he had found an ally that Eleanor had not anticipated: Marco De Luca. Marco, it turned out, had not stayed the small-time runner Eleanor remembered. In the years since their breakup, he had climbed the ranks of Vincent's organization with the relentless ambition of someone who had something to prove. He was now running operations in Brooklyn, not the restaurants or the dry cleaners, but the other operations, the ones that existed in the spaces between legitimate businesses like mold between tiles. Dominic had brought Marco in as his right hand, and Marco, who had never forgiven Elena for walking away from him, who saw her return not as a coincidence but as a personal affront, had embraced the role with enthusiasm. The specifics of their plan were laid out in a series of documents that Sal had discovered hidden in Dominic's office: bank statements, communications, and a detailed timeline for what Dominic called the correction. The plan was simple and brutal: force Vincent into early retirement by demonstrating that his restructuring was destroying the organization's income, install Dominic as the new head of operations, reverse every change Elena had made, and, this part made Elena's blood run cold, hand Elena over to the people she had been working to cut ties with as a gesture of loyalty. "Hand me over," Elena said, looking at the documents spread across the conference table. "What does that mean?" Sal looked uncomfortable. "It means they want to make an example of you, to show the old guard that the organization still handles things the old way." Elena felt the room tilt slightly, as if the building had shifted on its foundation. She gripped the edge of the table and steadied herself. Fear was a familiar companion. She had lived with it since she was 17, but this was different. This was not the abstract fear of what might happen. This was the specific, targeted fear of people who had decided she was a problem and had a plan for solving it. "Where is Vincent?" she asked. "At his home. I called him. He is on his way." "And Dominic?" "No one has seen him since last night." Elena looked at the documents again. She read them slowly, carefully, the way she had been trained to read legal briefs, looking not just at what was written, but at what was implied, what was missing, what did not add up. And something did not add up. The timeline showed that Dominic had been planning this for months, since before Elena had even arrived. That meant he had started laying the groundwork for his coup at almost the exact same time that Vincent had traveled to Chicago to recruit her, which raised a question that made Elena's mind race. Did Dominic know that Vincent was planning to go legitimate before Vincent had told anyone? And if so, how? The answer came to her like a slap. Vincent's phone, his office, his home. Dominic had been listening, not in the dramatic, wiretapping sense that would have required technology and expertise that Dominic did not possess, but in the simpler, more human sense. People talk, drivers overhear, housekeepers notice. In a world built on personal relationships and physical proximity, privacy is an illusion. Dominic had not needed to bug anything. He just needed to pay attention. Vincent arrived at the office at 5 in the morning. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the 2 hours since Sal's call. His overcoat was unbuttoned, his silver hair uncombed, and for the first time since Elena had known him, his hands were not steady. He read the documents without speaking. When he finished, he set them down on the table and stared at the wall for a long time. 23 years, he said quietly. I trusted him for 23 years. He was not trustworthy, Elena said. He was loyal. Those are not the same thing. Loyalty without principle is just obedience waiting for a better offer. Vincent looked at her. In his eyes she saw something she had never seen there before. Not the calculating intelligence, not the warm charm, not the guarded vulnerability. She saw despair. The raw, unfiltered despair of a man who had finally realized that the foundation he had built his life on was made of sand. "What do we do?" he asked, and the fact that he was asking her, not telling, not directing, but genuinely asking, told Elena everything she needed to know about how badly this had shaken him. She took a breath. She organized her thoughts the way she organized files, methodically, systematically, with each piece in its proper place. "We have 2 options," she said. "Option 1, we go to the authorities. We hand over everything. The documents, the financial records, all of it. Dominic goes down, but so does a significant part of the organization, and depending on what they find, you could face charges too. And option 2, we handle it ourselves. We use these documents to confront Dominic directly. We cut off his access to money, to people, to resources. We isolate him from the organization and force him out. It is riskier because Dominic is dangerous and he has allies. But it keeps control in your hands, which means we can continue the restructuring without outside interference." "And Marco?" Vincent asked. "What do we do about Marco?" Elena's jaw tightened. "Marco is Dominic's weapon. Remove Dominic, and Marco has no power. He is not a leader. He is a follower with ambition. Without someone to follow, he is nothing." Vincent studied her face. "This is personal for you, Marco." "Everything is personal," Elena said. "That does not mean I cannot be objective." Vincent nodded slowly. He picked up the documents, straightened them and placed them in a neat pile on the table. "Option 2, he said, "but we do it my way. I'm not going to start a conflict. I have spent my life in conflict and I am tired of it. We are going to give Dominic a choice. Leave willingly with enough money to start over somewhere else, or face the consequences of what is in these documents. No violence, no threats, just the truth, laid out plainly, and the opportunity to walk away with dignity." Elena wanted to argue. Every strategic instinct she had was screaming that giving Dominic a choice was the same as giving him time, and time was the most dangerous thing you could give a man like that. But she looked at Vincent, at the exhaustion in his face, at the grief in his eyes, at the quiet determination of a man who had promised his dying wife that he would become someone better. and she understood that this was not a strategic decision. It was a moral one. "Okay," she said. "Your way." The meeting was set for Friday evening at Vincent's home, a brownstone in the Belmont section of the Bronx, on a tree-lined street that felt like a different century. The house was elegant in the old-fashioned way, with dark wood paneling, bookshelves filled with Italian literature, and a garden in the back where Maria had grown tomatoes and basil until her illness made it impossible. Eleanor arrived early. She wore a simple black suit and carried a leather briefcase containing copies of all the documents. She felt the way she imagined a lawyer feels walking into a courtroom for a case they are not sure they can win, prepared, alert, and acutely aware that preparation can only take you so far. Dominic arrived at 7, alone, which surprised Elena. She had expected him to bring Marco, or at least some of his allies. The fact that he came alone meant one of two things. Either he was supremely confident, or he knew something they did not. He walked into the living room where Vincent and Elena were waiting. He looked at Vincent first, then at Eleanor. His face was unreadable, the blank, controlled expression of a man who had spent decades hiding his true feelings behind a mask of composure. "Vincent," he said. "Eleanor." It was the first time he had ever used her name. "Sit down, Dominic," Vincent said. Dominic sat. He did not remove his coat. He did not accept the coffee that was offered. He simply sat, perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, and waited. Vincent spoke first. He laid out the situation plainly, without anger or accusation. He described the documents, the plan, the alliance with Marco. He explained that he was giving Dominic a choice: leave the organization quietly, with a financial package that would allow him to live comfortably, or face the legal and personal consequences of his actions. Dominic listened without interrupting. When Vincent finished, the room was silent for a long moment. The clock on the mantel ticked. A car passed outside. The radiator clicked and hummed. Then Dominic spoke. "You think this is about money?" he said. His voice was low and controlled, but there was something underneath it. A vibration, like a wire pulled taut. "You think I spent 23 years at your side because of the paycheck?" "Dominic," Vincent began. "I was there when Maria was diagnosed," Dominic continued. "I was there when your son left. I was there when the feds took down Carmine, and we had to rebuild the entire Eastern operation in 6 weeks. I was there. Through every crisis, every setback, every moment that would have broken a lesser man. And you repay that by bringing in—" He glanced at Eleanor. "A child, a stranger, someone who knows nothing about who we are or what we have built." His voice did not rise. If anything, it got quieter, which was somehow more menacing than shouting. "I did not betray you, Vincent. You betrayed me. You looked at everything I have given you and decided it was not enough. You decided that you needed someone clean, someone presentable, someone who could help you pretend that the past never happened. But the past did happen, Vincent, and you cannot undo it by hiring a lawyer and filing some paperwork." Eleanor watched Dominic's face as he spoke, and she saw something she had not expected. Beneath the controlled anger, beneath the calculated defiance, there was pain. Real, raw, human pain. The pain of a man who had defined himself through his relationship to another man, who had sacrificed everything, morality, freedom, perhaps even his own identity, for that relationship, and who now felt that sacrifice being dismissed as irrelevant. It did not excuse what he had done. It did not make his plan any less dangerous. But it made him human in a way that Elena had not allowed herself to see before. "You are right," Elena said. Both men turned to look at her. "You are right that Vincent's past cannot be erased. You are right that your loyalty mattered, and that it has not been adequately recognized. And you are right that I am an outsider who does not fully understand the history between you two." She paused. She could feel Vincent's eyes on her, questioning, uncertain. "But you are wrong about one thing," she continued. "This is not about pretending the past did not happen. This is about choosing a different future. And that choice is not a betrayal of what you built together. It is the only way to save it." Dominic stared at her. The wire-taut vibration in his voice had gone, still replaced by something she could not quite read. "You do not know what you are talking about," he said, but the conviction in his voice had wavered, just slightly, like a candle flame in a draught. "Maybe not," Elena said, "but I know this. The world you built together is dying, not because of me and not because of Vincent's decision. It is dying because the world around it has changed, and things that do not adapt to change do not survive. You can fight that, and you might win for a while, but eventually the tide comes in. The question is not whether it is over. The question is whether it ends with something worth keeping, or whether it all goes down together." The room was quiet again. Dominic looked at Elena for a long time, his face working through something internal that she could not see. Then he stood up. "I will think about it," he said. He walked to the door, opened it, and paused. Without turning around, he said, "You are brave, Elena. I will give you that. Stupid, but brave." He left. Vincent exhaled. It was the first time Elena had seen him hold his breath. "That went better than I expected," he said. "He is not done," Elena said. "He said he would think about it. Men like Dominic do not think. They decide. And he has already decided, he just has not told us what." She was right. 3 days later, Dominic made his move. Monday morning started like any other. Eleanor was at her desk by 7, reviewing the latest financials for the construction company. Sal was, in the accounting office, reconciling invoices. The receptionist, a young woman named Christine, who had been with the company for 2 years, was brewing the first pot of coffee. At 8:15, Eleanor's phone rang. It was Keisha. "Elena, I need you to listen very carefully," Keisha said. Her voice had the clipped, efficient tone she used when something was seriously wrong. Keisha had moved to New York the previous year to work for a criminal justice non-profit in Brooklyn, and she and Elena had reconnected over dinners and long walks through Prospect Park. Eleanor had eventually told her the full story, not out of strategy, but out of the simple human need to be fully known by at least one person in the world. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "A friend of mine at the district attorney's office called me this morning. They have received an anonymous tip about Moretti Holdings, detailed financial information, names, dates, transaction records. Someone is feeding them everything, Eleanor. And from what my friend described, the information is extremely specific. This is not a leak. This is a flood." Eleanor's blood went cold. "Dominic. That is my guess, too. If he cannot have the organization, he is making sure no one can." Eleanor hung up and immediately went to Vincent's office. He was not there. She called his cell phone. No answer. She called his home. No answer. She called Sal. "Sal, have you heard from Vincent this morning?" "No, he was supposed to be here by 8. I assumed he was running late." Elena stood in Vincent's empty office, her mind racing. Dominic had gone to the authorities, not to cooperate. Men like Dominic did not cooperate, but to weaponize the information. By feeding the DA selective records, he could trigger an investigation that would consume Vincent and the organization, creating chaos that Dominic could exploit. It was the scorched earth strategy of a man who had decided that if he could not control the game, he would burn the board. She tried. Vincent again. No answer. She tried his driver. No answer. A sick feeling began to build in her stomach. She grabbed her coat and headed for the Bronx. The drive took 40 minutes in morning traffic. She took a cab because she did not trust herself to drive. Her hands were shaking, and the thoughts in her head were colliding like bumper cars. She kept telling herself that there was a reasonable explanation. Vincent was an older man who sometimes forgot to charge his phone. His driver might have called in sick. There were a dozen benign reasons why no one was picking up, but the feeling in her stomach, the one that had been her compass since she was 17 years old, was saying something different. She arrived at the brownstone on Arthur Avenue at 9:30. The street was quiet, the way residential streets in the Bronx are quiet on weekday mornings, children at school, adults at work, the neighborhood holding its breath until evening. The front door was unlocked. Elena pushed it open and stepped inside. The living room looked the same as it had on Friday night. The same dark wood paneling, the same bookshelves, the same clock on the mantel, which was now showing 9:32. But something was wrong. Not visually. Everything was in its place. But atmospherically. The house felt hollow, like a shell that had been emptied of its contents. She found Vincent in the garden. He was sitting on a stone bench next to Maria's old tomato beds, which were bare now in the late autumn cold. He was wearing the same clothes he had worn to the meeting on Friday, the dark suit, the white shirt, which told Elena he had not slept in his bed and possibly had not slept at all. He was holding the photograph of Sophia, the one from his desk. He was looking at it the way you look at something you are about to lose. "Vincent," Elena said softly, stepping through the back door into the garden. He looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face grey. He looked, for the first time, like what he was, a 63-year-old man who had spent his life carrying a weight that was finally crushing him. "Eleanor," he said, "I was going to call you." "What happened?" He set the photograph on the bench beside him. "Anthony called me last night. My son, the first time in 10 years. Do you know what he said?" Eleanor waited. "He said that a man came to his house in California, knocked on his door, told him things, specific things, about my business, about my life, about the people I work with, things that only someone inside the organization would know. And then this man, and I believe it was someone sent by Dominic, told my son that if I did not step down immediately, these same details would be sent to the press, the authorities, and every parent at my granddaughter's school." Vincent's voice cracked on the word school. It was the smallest fracture, but it was enough. "They are going after Sophia," he said. "Not physically. They would not do that. Even Dominic has lines he would not cross. But they are going to make sure she knows exactly who her grandfather is. Every detail, every shadow, every ugly truth I have spent my whole life trying to keep from her." Eleanor sat down on the bench beside him. The garden was cold and still. A crow sat on the fence watching them with its black bead eyes. "Vincent, listen to me," she said. "We can fight this. We have the documents. We have Sal's records. We can show that the restructuring is real, that you are genuinely transitioning." "It does not matter," Vincent said. "Do you not see? It does not matter what I do now. The past is the past. It does not become less real because I file new paperwork or hire better accountants. Dominic is right about one thing. I cannot undo what I have done, and my granddaughter will grow up knowing that her grandfather was a man who—" He stopped. He could not finish the sentence. Elena sat beside him in the cold garden and felt the weight of his silence. She thought about her own past, about Marco, about running, about the years she had spent trying to outpace the shadow of her own mistakes, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that Vincent's crisis was not about Dominic's threats. It was about the question that every person who has done harm must eventually face. Is redemption possible, or is it just a story we tell ourselves to make the darkness bearable? She did not have the answer. She was not sure anyone did. But she knew with the same bone-deep certainty that had carried her from East Harlem to Chicago to this frozen garden in the Bronx, that the question itself was worth fighting for. "Vincent," she said, "I need you to tell me everything. Everything about the organization, everything about the finances, everything about the people involved. Not the version you told me before, the real version. The one with the parts you left out because you were afraid they would change how I see you." He looked at her. "If I do that, you might not want to help me anymore." "Maybe," she said, "but right now the only thing more dangerous than the truth is the half-truth, and I would rather deal with the whole ugly picture than try to fight a battle with one eye closed." Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Then he began to talk. He talked for 3 hours. He told her things she had suspected and things she had not. He told her about operations she had never been allowed to see, about relationships with people whose names she had never heard, about decisions he had made in moments of desperation or greed or fear that had hardened over time into facts he could not change. He told her about the human cost of his business, not in abstractions, but in specific stories about specific people whose lives had been diminished or destroyed by the machinery he had built. Elena listened without interrupting. She took notes, not for documentation, but for understanding. She needed to see the whole picture, no matter how ugly, because she could not navigate a landscape she could not see. When he finished, the garden was colder, and the light had changed. The crow was gone. The bare tomato stalks cast thin shadows across the stone bench. Elena looked at her notes, she looked at Vincent, and she made a decision. "Here is what we are going to do," she said. "We are going to call the district attorney ourselves, before Dominic's information lands. We are going to walk in, lay everything on the table, and cooperate fully. Not because it is the safe choice, it is not, but because it is the right one, and because it is the only move Dominic will not expect." Vincent stared at her. "You are asking me to turn myself in. I am asking you to stop running from who you were and start building who you want to be. You told me Maria asked you to become the man she always knew you could be. This is what that looks like, Vincent. It does not look like a clean suit and a new logo on the building. It looks like standing up, taking responsibility, and trusting that the truth, even when it hurts, is better than the lie." Vincent looked at the photograph of Sophia, still lying on the bench beside him. "If I do this," he said, "I might never see her." "If you do not do this," Elena replied, "she will never know the real you. She will only know the version that Dominic wants to show her. Is that what you want? For Dominic Ferraro to be the one who defines your legacy?" It was the right question at the right moment. Elena saw it land, saw the shift in Vincent's eyes, the subtle straightening of his spine, the way his hands stopped trembling and became still. "No," he said, "that is not what I want." "Then let us go," Elena said, "together." They stood up. Vincent picked up the photograph of Sophia and slipped it into his coat pocket. He took one last look at the garden, at Maria's empty beds, at the stone bench where they used to sit together in the evenings, at the quay, house that had been his anchor and his prison for decades. Then he turned and walked inside, and Elena followed. The meeting at the district attorney's office lasted 8 hours. It was held in a windowless conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Lower Manhattan, with fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency just below the threshold of consciousness, like tinnitus for the soul. Vincent spoke for most of it. He sat at a long table across from 3 assistant district attorneys, 2 federal agents, and a court reporter whose fingers moved across her keyboard with the mechanical precision of a pianist playing scales. Elena sat beside him, not as his lawyer. She had recused herself from any legal representation due to her involvement with the organization, but as a witness, a corroborating source, and, in a sense she could not have anticipated, a moral anchor. He told them everything, not just the broad strokes, but the details, the specific mechanisms of each operation, the flow of money through the legitimate businesses, the names and roles of every person involved. He held nothing back, not out of desperation, but out of something that looked, to Elena's eyes, like relief. The relief of a man who had been carrying a stone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. The prosecutors were professional and thorough. They asked precise questions, sought clarification, cross-referenced his statements with documents they already had, some of which, Elena realized, had come from Dominic's anonymous tip. But Vincent's testimony was more comprehensive, more detailed, and more honest than anything Dominic had provided, because Dominic had been selective in his disclosure, feeding the DA only the information that served his agenda, while withholding anything that might implicate himself. Vincent's honesty was a different kind of weapon. It was complete, unsparing, and aimed as much at himself as at anyone else. By the end of the day, the outlines of a cooperation agreement were in place. Vincent would face charges, there was no avoiding that, but his full cooperation, combined with the extensive restructuring work Elena had already completed, positioned him for significantly reduced consequences. More importantly, the information he provided would enable the prosecution of Dominic and his network, dismantling the shadow operations that Vincent had been trying to eliminate from the inside. Dominic was taken into custody 3 days later at a hotel in Newark, where he had been staying under a false name. Marco De Luca was arrested the same morning at his apartment in Brooklyn. Both were charged with multiple offenses related to racketeering, conspiracy, and financial crimes. The news hit the press within hours, and for a brief, intense period, the story of Vincent Moretti's organization was headline material. Reporters camped outside the brownstone on Arthur Avenue. Legal analysts debated the significance of the case on cable news. Eleanor's name appeared in a few articles as a legal consultant who facilitated the transition, though her full role was never publicly disclosed. And then, as news cycles do, it moved on. New stories emerged, new scandals broke, new dramas captured the public's attention. The world is a river, and even the biggest stones eventually get covered by the current. Vincent's case moved through the legal system over the following months. The cooperation agreement held. He received a sentence that reflected both the severity of his past and the sincerity of his transformation. It was consequential, but not devastating. He would serve time, but not as much as he would have without Elena's restructuring or his own cooperation. The day before Vincent reported to begin his sentence, he called Elena and asked her to come to the brownstone one last time. She arrived in the late afternoon. The house was quieter than she had ever known it. The staff had been let go, the offices closed, the last remnants of the empire packed into boxes and shipped to storage. The bookshelves were still full. Vincent had donated his collection to a library in the neighborhood, but the rest of the house had been stripped to its essentials, like a body shedding weight before a long journey. Vincent was in the living room, sitting in an armchair by the window. He was wearing a simple sweater and slacks, no suit, no overcoat, no costume of authority. He looked smaller than she remembered, and also somehow more present, more real, as if the person she was seeing now was the one who had been hiding underneath the performance all along. "Elena," he said, "thank you for coming." She sat across from him. The late afternoon light came through the window in long golden shafts, illuminating the dust motes that floated in the air like tiny, purposeless travelers. "I want to tell you something," Vincent said. "Something I should have said a long time ago." Elena waited. "When I came to that restaurant in Chicago, when I sat down and made you that offer, I told you it was because I was impressed by you, by your intelligence, your resilience, your character, and that was true. But it was not the whole truth." He paused. His hands were folded in his lap, very still. "The whole truth is that I came to you because I was ashamed. Ashamed of what I had done to you through Marco. Ashamed that a young girl, because that is what you were, Eleanor, a girl, had been caught up in my world and damaged by it, because one of my men saw her as a useful prop. I came to you not just because you could help me, but because I owed you. Because every day that I allowed my organization to operate the way it did was a day I chose my comfort over someone else's safety. And you were one of the people who paid for that choice." Elena felt something shift inside her. Not a dramatic revelation, but a subtle realignment, like a compass needle finding north after a long period of confusion. She had always known on some level that Vincent's offer had been motivated by more than strategic calculation. But hearing him say it, hearing him name the shame, own it, and present it to her without artifice or excuse, was different from knowing it. It was the difference between reading about rain and standing in it. "I know," she said. "I have known for a while." "And you stayed anyway," Vincent said. Not a question, a statement, spoken with something that sounded like wonder. "I stayed because the work mattered," Elena said, "and because people are more than the worst things they have done. That does not mean the worst things do not matter. They do. They matter enormously, but they are not the whole story. And I believe, I have to believe, that the chapter we are writing now carries as much weight as the chapters that came before." Vincent looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you," he said. Elena took it. Inside was a letter, handwritten on plain paper. She unfolded it and read, It was from Anthony Moretti, Vincent's son, the man who had not spoken to his father in 10 years. The letter was brief. It said that Anthony had been following the case in the news, that he had read about Elena's role in the restructuring and the cooperation with the authorities, that he had spoken with his mother's sister, who had told him things about Vincent's final months of freedom that had surprised him, stories of late nights working to undo decades of damage, of conversations about legacy and responsibility, of a young woman who had somehow convinced a man at the end of his rope to choose the harder right over the easier wrong. And it said this: "I am not ready to forgive him. I may never be. But I wanted you to know that because of what you did, I am at least willing to try to understand him. That may not sound like much, but from where I am, standing, it feels like everything." Elena read the letter twice. Then she folded it and placed it back in the envelope. "He is going to be okay," she said. "Anthony, Sophia, they are going to be okay." Vincent's eyes were bright, but he did not cry. He had spent a lifetime teaching himself not to show vulnerability, and even now, at the end, old habits held. "There is one more thing," he said. "Dominic and Marco." Elena's expression tightened. "What about them?" "They are both going to face trial. The prosecutors will need witnesses. They will want you to testify. And when you do, you will have the opportunity to say things that could destroy them, not just legally, personally. You know things about both of them that would humiliate them in open court, things that would strip away every shred of dignity they have left." Eleanor nodded. She did know those things. She knew about Dominic's private insecurities, the ones he hid behind his controlled exterior. She knew about Marco's deceptions, the gap between the image he projected and the person he actually was. She had the ammunition to reduce both of them to rubble, and she would be lying if she said the temptation was not there. "When you are on that stand," Vincent said, "you will have a choice. You can use what you know to wound them, or you can stick to the facts and let the evidence speak for itself. I am not going to tell you what to do, but I will say this. The greatest act of strength I have ever witnessed is mercy shown by someone who has the power to be merciless, and I believe you are strong enough for that." The trial began 4 months later. Eleanor was called as a witness on the 9th day. She walked into the courtroom wearing a navy blue suit and carrying a folder of documents, and she felt every eye in the room turn toward her. The prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the jury, the judge, the journalists in the gallery, and sitting at the defense table, Dominic Ferraro and Marco De Luca. She had not seen Marco in years. He looked different, older, thinner, with lines around his eyes that had not been there before. But his posture was the same, upright, stiff, projecting confidence he did not feel. And when their eyes met across the courtroom, she saw a flicker of something in his face that she recognized, not remorse exactly, but awareness. The awareness of a man who was looking at the consequences of his choices and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that they were real. Dominic, by contrast, was perfectly composed. He sat in his chair with the stillness she had come to associate with him, that controlled, reptilian patience, and he looked at her with an expression that was equal parts contempt and curiosity, as if she were a puzzle he had not yet solved. The prosecutor's questions were thorough. They walked Elena through her history with the organization, her role in the restructuring, her discovery of Dominic's plan, and the events leading up to Vincent's cooperation with the authorities. She answered clearly, concisely, and without emotion, presenting the facts the way she had been trained to, as building blocks, each one placed precisely to construct a picture that the jury could see and understand. Then came the cross-examination. Dominic's attorney was a sharp, experienced lawyer named Gerald Whitfield, who had built his career defending people that other lawyers would not touch. He was smooth and probing, and he knew exactly where to push. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, "is it not true that you initially entered into a relationship with Marco De Luca voluntarily?" "Yes," Elena said. "And is it not true that during that relationship you benefited materially from Mr. De Luca's resources?" "He bought me groceries and a laptop, yes." "And is it not true that when you left New York, you did so not because of any direct threat, but because you were afraid of what might happen. I left because my photograph was slipped under my door by someone who had been following me. That is not a hypothetical fear, Mr. Whitfield. That is a direct message." Whitfield paused. He adjusted his glasses. He was building towards something, and Elena could feel it coming the way you feel a wave approaching before it reaches the shore. "Ms. Vasquez, you have presented yourself as someone who sought to reform Mr. Moretti's organization from within, a crusader for justice, if you will. But is it not true that you accepted funding from Mr. Moretti for your education? Funding that came from the very organization you now claim to have been working to dismantle?" "Yes," Elena said. "That is true." "So you benefited from the very system you are now helping to prosecute?" "Yes," Elena said again. "I did. And if the question you are really asking is whether that makes me a hypocrite, the answer is maybe. I was 17 years old, alone and afraid. A man offered me a way out, and I took it. I am not proud of every choice I made, but I am here, under oath, telling the truth about all of them. Can everyone in this room say the same?" The courtroom was silent. Whitfield looked at her for a moment, then moved on to his next question. But the moment that mattered, the moment that would define everything, came near the end of her testimony, when the prosecutor asked her to describe Dominic Ferraro's character and motivations. This was the opening, the chance to unload everything she knew, the private fears, the insecurities, the petty cruelties she had witnessed behind closed doors. She could paint a portrait of Dominic that would follow him for the rest of his life, a portrait so vivid and damning that no jury could look at him without seeing the smallness beneath the surface. She looked at Dominic across the courtroom. He was watching her with that same controlled stillness, but behind it, in the lines of his face and the set of his jaw, she could see the tension. He knew what she could do. He was bracing for it. And in that moment, Elena thought about her mother, about Rosa, who had worked 3 jobs without complaint, who had accepted hardship without bitterness, who had taught her daughter, not through words, but through the daily practice of her life, that strength is not about what you do when you have power. It is about who you become. She thought about Vincent, sitting in a facility upstate, paying for his past with his present. She thought about Anthony's letter, about Sophia, about the possibility that a family broken by decades of bad choices might somehow find its way back to each other. And she thought about herself, about the girl who had run from New York with $43 and a fear that felt like it had replaced her bones, about the woman who had built a life out of nothing, who had walked into rooms full of powerful men and held her own, who had looked at the darkest parts of the human experience and refused to let them define her. When she could humiliate those who broke her, she chose forgiveness. "Mr. Ferraro," she said, "is a man who gave his entire adult life to an organization that asked him to sacrifice his humanity in exchange for belonging. He made terrible choices, and he should be held accountable for them. But his motivations were not purely malicious. They were rooted in loyalty, fear, and a desperate need to matter in a world that had never told him he was enough. I do not say this to excuse what he did. I say it because it is the truth, and the truth is what I promised to tell." The courtroom was absolutely still. Whitfield stared at her, the prosecutor stared at her, the jury stared at her, and Dominic Ferraro, for the first time in all the years Elena had known him, looked away. He turned his head to the side just slightly, and Elena saw his jaw clench and his eyes close, and she understood that what she had given him was not mercy. It was recognition, the acknowledgement that even in his worst moments he had been a human being, not a monster. And that distinction, the one between a monster and a broken person, was the space where Grace lived. She looked at Marco. He was watching her with wide eyes, and in those eyes she saw something she had never seen there before. Not the charm, not the calculation, not the hollow confidence. She saw a man who had just watched someone he had wronged choose to dignify him instead of destroy him, and who did not know what to do with that. It was as if she had handed him something, precious and fragile, and he was afraid to hold it because he had never been trusted with something that mattered. Elena stepped down from the witness stand. She walked through the courtroom, past the lawyers and the jury and the journalists, past Dominic and Marco, past the ghosts of every fear and every lie and every moment of doubt that had brought her to this point. She walked out the door and into the hallway, where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the marble floors echoed with her footsteps, and she kept walking until she reached the exit, where the daylight hit her face like a hand reaching out to steady her. She stood on the courthouse steps and breathed. The city roared around her, traffic, voices, the perpetual symphony of 10 million people living their lives in the same impossible, beautiful, maddening place. She thought about how far she had come, and how far she still had to go, and how the distance between those 2 points was not measured in miles, but in choices. Her phone buzzed. It was Keisha. "How did it go?" Keisha asked. "I told the truth," Eleanor said. "The whole truth?" Eleanor smiled. It was a tired smile, the kind that comes after a long fight, when you're not sure if you won, but you know you did not lose yourself. "The truest truth I had," she said. In the weeks that followed, the trial concluded. The jury delivered its verdicts. Dominic and Marco were both found guilty on multiple counts. The sentencing was fair, harsh enough to reflect the severity of their actions, but not cruel. The judge cited Elena's testimony as a model of integrity, noting that her willingness to present even the defendants in a balanced light had strengthened, not weakened, the prosecution's case. Vincent Moretti's cooperation agreement was honored in full. His sentence was reduced, and the terms of his confinement allowed for eventual supervised visits with family members. Anthony did not visit immediately, but he began exchanging letters with his father. Short, careful letters, the kind that 2 people write when they are trying to rebuild a bridge that has been burned for a decade. The letters were not warm, they were not forgiving, but they were present, which was more than either of them had dared to hope for. Elena returned to Chicago. She opened a small law practice in a storefront on the West Side, specializing in cases that most lawyers did not want: immigration disputes, housing rights, wrongful terminations. She charged what her clients could afford, which was often very little, and she supplemented her income by teaching an evening class at the community college, where she had once been a student. Her mother, Rosa, came to the office every Saturday morning with a thermos of coffee and a container of food she had cooked the night before. She would sit in the waiting room, reading the newspaper, while Elena worked in the back. They did not talk much during these visits. They did not need to. Rosa's presence, steady, uncomplaining, enduring, was its own kind of conversation, a reminder that some kinds of love do not need words to be understood. One evening, about 6 months after the trial, Elena was closing up the office when she found a letter in her mailbox. It had no return address. She opened it and found a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. It was from Dominic Ferraro. The note was short. It said, "I have spent my life believing that the world is divided into 2 kinds of people, those who take and those who get taken from. You showed me there is a 3rd kind, those who give even when they have every reason not to. I do not expect you to forgive me. But I wanted you to know that what you said in that courtroom changed something in me that I did not think could be changed. I do not know what to call it. I am not sure it has a name, but it is there, and it is because of you." Elena read the note twice. Then she folded it and placed it in her desk drawer next to Anthony's letter and the plain white business card with the phone number that had started everything. She locked the office, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and walked home through the evening streets of Chicago. The air was cool, the sky was turning purple at the edges, and somewhere in the distance a church bell was ringing, not for any particular occasion, just because it was evening, and evenings deserve to be noticed. She thought about the title of the story, that someone might tell about her life, if someone were inclined to tell it. When she could humiliate those who broke her, she chose forgiveness, and the Mafia boss changed. But that was not quite right, she decided, because it was not just the Mafia boss who changed, it was all of them. It was Marco who had written her a letter from where he was being held, a rambling, unpolished letter full of apologies that were clumsy and incomplete, but clearly sincere. It was Dominic, who had spent his life believing that mercy was weakness and was now sitting in a cell trying to understand why the strongest person he had ever met was the one who had shown him the most mercy. It was Anthony, who was slowly, painfully, reluctantly opening the door to a relationship with a father he had spent a decade hating. It was Rosa, who had sacrificed everything for her daughter and was now watching that daughter become the kind of person she had always prayed she would be. And it was Elena herself. Because forgiveness, she had learned, is not something you give to other people. It is something you give to yourself. It is the decision to put down the stone you have been carrying and walk forward without it, not because the person who hurt you deserves to be forgiven, but because you deserve to be free. She walked home, she cooked dinner. She sat at her small kitchen table and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. And when she was finished, she washed her plate, turned off the lights, and went to bed, where she slept deeply and peacefully, the way a person sleeps when they have nothing left to carry. If you watched until here, it is because this story touched something real inside you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who you are and understand who truly loves the stories on this channel. If this story moved you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who is carrying a weight they do not need to carry anymore. Someone who needs to be reminded that the bravest thing a person can do is choose mercy when the whole world is expecting revenge. And if you are not subscribed yet, subscribe now. Every week, stories like Elena's are shared here. Stories about ordinary people who face impossible choices and find the extraordinary within themselves. Do not miss the next one. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join this community of people who believe that the best stories are the ones that change how you see the world. This was Elena's story, but in a way it is all of ours, because every single day we face the same choice she did, to wound or to heal, to tear down or to build up, to hold on to our anger or to let it go. And every single day we get to decide what kind of person we want to be. Choose wisely, and remember, forgiveness is not weakness. It is the strongest thing a human being can do.